against women. It has to stop.
The work that we're talking about today on violence against women is about how we got the issue of violence against women onto the world agenda. Many of us, in the process of seeing violence as a human rights issue, also recognize that women have to be defending human rights overall, because you're not going to get rights for women if you don't have respect for human rights as a whole.
Please join me in welcoming Charlotte Bunch, founder and executive director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership.
I didn't start this work as a person with power in the UN. I started this work as a person who jumped up and grabbed the mic from those who had power to say something that wasn't being said. Part of my job now is to, in fact, find ways to help give the mic to people who don't have that access, because we won't find the answers if we don't hear from a wider range of people. The problem with too many US white Americans in the world is they are either completely apologetic and think they have nothing to offer, or they're completely arrogant and think they have all the answers. And neither of those is true. We don't have all the answers. Our society is not what I want it to be, but we do have some experience to bring to the table, and that's what people want. When I was a child, I grew up believing that I should do something with my life, but women were not necessarily expected to have careers.
Would you give up your career if the right man proposed?
No, I wouldn't. My career means too much to me.
Not even if your dream Prince Charming were the man?
I was very active as a student in the student Christian movement, and that's really where I began to discover the civil rights movement, where I began to learn about and be active against the war in Vietnam. And even eventually, part of my coming out as a feminist was in that context. What shaped a lot of my view was really the experience of the Black civil rights movement in the South. I saw leaders of that movement, many of whom at that point were Black men who came out of the church, who came out of a tradition of speaking the truth and using that to mobilize people. I was very inspired. This was an exciting thing to do, that you could really organize around a vision of what you wanted to see happen. It was really as I began to discover my sexuality as a lesbian that I began to feel that this was too much in conflict with what the church, even the more social gospel churches, taught about homosexuality. I moved more completely into a secular, feminist, New Left kind of context for my work. I joined in the movement for feminism and women's liberation because I wanted a different life for myself also. I wanted to be able to live the life I wanted to live as a lesbian. I wanted to be out. I know what it means to be silenced. I began to see the need for addressing human rights from a feminist perspective. But I was really doing work with the UN for almost a decade before I started thinking specifically about women's rights as human rights. We began to look at how women could get access to refugee status, what it would mean if women were seen as human rights victims, how do you get violence against women addressed at the international level. I fully believe that something like violence against women affects everybody in society. All of us suffer from the way in which children learn to have disrespect for women at a very young age, whether it's in their personal home or in the media. Well, that's what the Women's Rights as Human Rights movement began to try to do. We organized specifically for the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993 because we saw this as an opportunity. It was the first time the UN had had a World Conference on Human Rights in about 25 years.
In reporting on this tribunal, we must ask this body to consider: why was such a tribunal necessary? Why has this area of massive violation of women remained invisible for so long? And what will the world community do to redress this abuse in the future?
When women's rights was first emerging, there was a sense that this was coming from women everywhere. At that moment in the early 90s, I think there was more acceptance that human rights is always challenging culture.
Abuses of women have too long been dismissed as private, family, cultural, or religious matters. Today, we demand that they be seen for what they are: fundamental violations of the right to life, liberty, and security of person as guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
There has been a much more decisive effort on the part of people who don't want women's rights to succeed to use culture as an excuse. Working in the social movement is really about collaboration, and it's about everyone having a voice. We're now working to have a stronger and more powerful voice for women's rights at the global level. If we don't hear from all those different places, and if we only privilege the dominant discourse, then we're not going to get the change that we want. I know that for the world to change the way I want it to change, we have to know how sexism and racism and homophobia and classism affect different groups of women. Every time I engage with a group that's background is different than my own, I'm there to learn something about their experience of these questions, and they're also there to learn something from me. I want a different idea of what it is to be an American in the world, so I try to live by the way I would like to see US people engage in the world, which is a collaborative sharing of whatever we've learned that's useful, and a learning as you would collaborate with anybody. You have to believe that it's possible to do it, and you have to be willing to put yourself wherever you see possibilities to be engaged. But really going to wherever you see action and possibility of making action around something you care about, and moving and building from there. I don't do my work for somebody else. I do it in solidarity as being part of wanting to change the world that we live in. It's all about finding ways to expose and bring pressure on governments to make changes. And that is really at the heart of human rights work.
Start